The Whitmores were the kind of couple people in their neighborhood pointed to when describing what a happy, stable marriage should look like. Their two-story brick home sat neatly at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its garden always trimmed, flowers blooming in careful rows that Claire tended with pride. Daniel was often seen mowing the lawn in pressed polos and waving to neighbors, while Claire with her soft smile carried trays of cookies over to welcome new families. Together they projected an image of balance, devotion and success. For years people admired them. They had everything: financial comfort, community respect, and what appeared to be an unshakable bond. Daniel worked as a financial advisor for a respected firm downtown. His clients trusted him not just with money but with advice on how to build their futures, and his colleagues praised his charisma and polished confidence. He had a talent for making people feel at ease, the kind of skill that won him clients easily and made him appear irreplaceable at the office. Claire, on the other hand, lived a quieter life. She worked part-time at a local florist shop, a job she adored because it kept her surrounded by beauty and color. Her afternoons were spent arranging bouquets, while mornings were dedicated to managing the household. For years she seemed content, filling her days with small joys and her weekends with family gatherings and outings. To anyone watching from the outside, the Whitmores had constructed a life that was enviable. Their house glowed with warm light in the evenings, their car was new, and their vacations were meticulously photographed and displayed on social media. Claire often posted smiling pictures of the two of them at dinners, at concerts, or simply standing in front of their garden with mugs of coffee. Those who knew them only casually believed they had no problems at all. But perfection has a way of hiding cracks beneath its surface, and what looked like stability was slowly shifting towards something darker. It started subtly, so subtly, that even Claire herself didn't register the change at first. Daniel began coming home later than usual, claiming to be burdened by an influx of clients needing urgent financial planning. At first, Claire brushed it off. He was ambitious, she thought, and success demanded sacrifices. But the late nights stretched into weekends at the office, and the excuses became repetitive. Claire would sit at the dinner table with meals growing cold, listening to the silence of their home echo around her. He returned with the faint smell of unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, and although she noticed, she told herself not to dwell on it. Denial, after all, is easier than confrontation. Friends occasionally mentioned how hard Daniel was working, how dedicated he seemed, and Claire nodded with practiced ease. But privately, she was uneasy. Small details gnawed at her. His phone never left his side, even when he showered. He was distracted in conversation, his eyes flicking away whenever she asked about his day. Claire began to feel invisible in her own marriage, like the life she had built was shifting into something she could no longer recognize. One night, she lay awake, while Daniel slept soundly beside her, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rhythm of his breathing. A thought formed in her mind that she couldn't silence. What if he wasn't really working late? Once planted, that thought grew like a seed, digging its roots deeper each day. She tried to push it aside, reminding herself of their history, of the man she had trusted for over a decade. But every unanswered call, every vague explanation, every distant smile reinforced the suspicion until it became impossible to ignore. Claire's unease wasn't the kind that disappeared with time. It expanded into her daily routines, pressing on her with quiet persistence. At the florist shop, while she tied ribbons around bouquets, she wondered what Daniel was doing at that very moment. At home, folding laundry, she inspected his shirts more carefully, noticing traces of cologne that didn't belong to him. Each discovery made her stomach twist tighter, yet she kept her doubts hidden. To admit them aloud would mean shattering the fragile image she had clung to for so long. The Whitmores' perfect facade remained intact to the outside world, but inside their home, Claire lived with a growing sense of unease that colored everything she touched. She told herself that perhaps she was overthinking, that maybe he was simply stressed with work. But beneath those reassurances lived a quiet certainty. Something had changed, and whatever it was, it would eventually rise to the surface. Claire could not yet know how devastating that truth would be, or how it would unravel not only her marriage, but the very life she thought she knew. What looked like a simple, ordinary marriage was already drifting toward a secret that would soon ignite into something deadly. Claire's life shifted the day she stumbled across the evidence that confirmed her worst fears. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those quiet stretches where the house seemed too still, and she found herself tidying in silence. Daniel had left for work early, claiming a breakfast meeting, and she decided to catch up on laundry. When she picked up his shirt from the hamper, his phone slipped from the pocket and landed on the floor with a dull thud. For a moment she thought nothing of it, only that it needed to be set aside. But the screen lit up with a message, and instinct urged her eyes toward it. What she saw froze her. The words on the screen were not businesslike or neutral. They were affectionate, playful, laced with a kind of intimacy. Daniel no longer showed her. She stood there with the shirt in her hands, staring at the illuminated text, her heart hammering in her chest. Against every hesitation she unlocked his phone, and what unfolded before her eyes was undeniable. Thread after thread of messages filled the screen, stolen moments, secret plans, and words of devotion exchanged between Daniel and a woman named Melissa. The tone was unmistakable, the kind of writing that didn't need interpretation. It was an affair, raw and unhidden within those glowing lines of text. Her breath came sharp and shallow as she scrolled further. Photos appeared. Melissa smiling in carefully posed selfies. Melissa leaning across a bar with a drink in her hand. Melissa sending Daniel fragments of her life, like gifts. And there were photos of him too. Images he had taken when he was supposed to be at work, smirking into the camera as if the world belonged to him. The betrayal hit Claire in waves. She sat down on the edge of the bed, the phone trembling in her grip, and tried to process what she was looking at. Years of trust unraveled in an instant, replaced by a hollow ache that stretched through her chest. Her first thought was to confront him immediately, but the weight of shock pinned her still. Instead, she carefully placed the phone back where she had found it, folded the shirt and finished the laundry as if nothing had happened. Outwardly she maintained her calm, but inside something had cracked. The woman who had once trusted her husband implicitly was gone, replaced by someone consumed by questions. How long had this been going on? Where had he taken her? How many nights had she sat at home waiting while he was with Melissa? That evening, when Daniel returned home, Claire watched him closely. His smile was warm, his manner relaxed, but now she noticed the subtle details. The scent of cologne stronger than usual, the faint mark on his collar, the glow of satisfaction that seemed out of place after a supposed late night at the office. He kissed her on the cheek, sat down for dinner, and carried on as if nothing were wrong. Claire smiled back, nodded at his stories, and tucked her rage beneath a mask of composure. But her mind was alive with the knowledge of his deception, and she stored every detail like ammunition. In the days that followed, she became an investigator in her own home. She tracked his movements with quiet precision, noting the times he left and returned, the excuses he gave, and the gaps in his stories. She checked his receipts when he emptied his pockets, finding charges for restaurants she had never been to, gifts she had never received. When he claimed to be swamped at the office, she drove past the building late at night, only to see his car missing from the lot. Each discovery deepened the wound, yet she kept silent, waiting, gathering evidence, piece by piece. Melissa's name grew larger in Claire's mind, a shadow that followed her everywhere. She knew little about her beyond what she had pieced together from the texts and photos, but that was enough to ignite a consuming anger. Melissa wasn't just a stranger, she was the other half of the betrayal, the living proof that Claire's life had been invaded and stolen. While arranging flowers at the shop, Claire caught herself wondering if Melissa ever bought bouquets, if she ever walked through the same streets. The thought made her skin crawl. At night, when Daniel slipped easily into sleep, Claire lay awake with thoughts circling endlessly. Divorce crossed her mind, but the word felt hollow, inadequate against the storm she carried inside. It wasn't simply about ending the marriage. It was about the humiliation, the years wasted, the image shattered. Her heart ached for the man she thought she knew, yet that ache transformed into something heavier, an anger that refused to fade. By the time weeks had passed, Claire was no longer in denial. The betrayal was real, and so was her determination to uncover every detail. She moved with quiet purpose, watching, listening, piecing together a map of lies that revealed Daniel's second life. She knew now that Melissa wasn't just a passing fling. This was a relationship threaded with passion and secrecy. One Daniel had built carefully while dismantling his life with Claire without even realizing it. The discovery had changed everything. Claire could no longer look at her husband without seeing the weight of his deceit. She could no longer enter her home without feeling the presence of someone else woven into its walls. Though she hadn't yet decided what she would do, one truth burned inside her. She could not let this betrayal stand. Something would have to break, and when it did, the cost would be devastating. Claire's heartbreak did not remain still. It grew restless, turning in her chest like a storm she could not calm. The first days after her discovery had been filled with numbness. But as weeks passed, her numbness hardened into something sharper. She had once built her life around trust, love, and small routines. But now each routine felt hollow. Folding laundry reminded her of the photos she had seen. Cooking dinner reminded her of nights he had skipped. And every time she walked past the mirror, she saw a woman who had been made invisible by lies. What had begun as sorrow slowly transformed into obsession. Her mind latched on to Melissa. The name lingered with her through every waking hour. She no longer thought of Daniel's affair as something that belonged to both of them. In her mind it was Melissa who had invaded, Melissa who had ruined her marriage, Melissa who had replaced her. Claire began to see her as more than just a woman. She became a symbol of everything Claire had lost. The anger that burned inside of her was not directed only at Daniel. It found its target in Melissa, growing heavier each time Claire imagined her laughing at a text message or standing too close to the man who had once belonged only to her. She started with small searches. On her phone at night, she typed Melissa's name into social media, scrolling through images of her smiling at parties, posing with friends, celebrating birthdays. Claire studied every photo as if it held a hidden code. She took note of what Melissa wore, who she spent time with, what restaurants she visited. Each discovery fueled her anger further, making Melissa feel less like a stranger and more like an intruder. Claire knew intimately. She felt a kind of twisted familiarity, as though she were living alongside her without ever meeting face to face. Her curiosity escalated into action. Claire began driving past Daniel's office more frequently, watching the windows from her car parked across the street. She learned the hours when Melissa arrived and when she left, watching the way she carried herself, the confidence in her walk. On one occasion, Claire followed her to a cafe, sitting in her car as Melissa ordered a coffee, her laughter carrying faintly through the glass. Claire sat there for an hour, clutching the steering wheel, unable to take her eyes off her. The longer she stared, the more the anger grew, pressing into her, until she felt her whole body tighten with resentment. The obsession began to alter Claire's life in visible ways. Neighbors noticed that she no longer tended her once pristine garden. The flowers wilted, weeds spread across the yard, and the woman who used to bring baked goods to block parties had vanished. At work she became distracted, arranging bouquets with trembling hands and leaving early with vague excuses. Her co-workers whispered about how tired and hollow she seemed, but no one asked questions directly. In her home, meals went uneaten, chores were abandoned, and she spent long nights pacing in silence. Everywhere she turned, Claire found reminders of Melissa. When Daniel left late at night, she imagined them together, and the thought twisted into visions she couldn't erase. When his phone buzzed, she didn't need to look to know who it was. Each vibration cut into her like a knife. Her rage wasn't loud or explosive. It was slow, quiet, like a tide rising in the dark, waiting to drown everything in its path. She began to keep a notebook, hidden in her dresser, filling its pages with observations. Dates, times, places where Daniel had been, and where Melissa appeared. It looked almost like a detective's logbook, But instead of gathering evidence for truth, it was a record of betrayal feeding her hatred. Each line written gave her the illusion of control, though in reality, it pulled her deeper into obsession. The more she wrote, the more inevitable it felt that something had to happen. Inside her mind, she began crafting justifications. She told herself Melissa knew Daniel was married, that she must have seen the ring on his hand, that she had chosen to continue anyway. She painted Melissa not as a victim of his deceit, but as a willing participant, even an instigator. The story she told herself became a shield, one that allowed her anger to sharpen without guilt. By the time she had convinced herself fully, there was no room left for empathy or reason. At night, she imagined different scenarios. She thought about confronting Daniel with the truth she had gathered, exposing him for what he was. She imagined walking into Melissa's apartment, looking her in the eye, and demanding she disappear from their lives forever. But alongside these thoughts lived darker ones, ideas that frightened her at first, but became more familiar with repetition. Thoughts of what it would take to truly end this pain, to erase the presence of the woman who haunted her every moment. By then, Claire was no longer the woman who once smiled gently in her garden, or laughed with neighbors on warm evenings. She had become hollowed out, consumed by a single purpose. Her heartbreak had transformed into obsession, and that obsession was sharpening into a dangerous resolve. The life she once knew had already ended. What came next was a life ruled by rage, one that edged closer each day to a breaking point. The night of violence began like any other, with Daniel announcing he would be late at the office once again. He stood in the kitchen, loosening his tie and muttering about deadlines, while Claire watched in silence. By now she knew the truth. She had memorized his patterns, learned to recognize the signs. His hair freshly styled, his shirt pressed, his cologne strong. It was not the look of a man buried in paperwork. It was the look of someone preparing for a secret rendezvous. She nodded as he left, her expression calm, but inside her pulse beat hard against her ribs. Tonight, she told herself, she would no longer sit in silence. Tonight she would follow. Rain had begun to fall in a steady drizzle, coating the streets in a silver sheen. Claire waited 15 minutes before leaving, enough time for him to feel secure. She slipped on a dark coat and slid the kitchen knife into her pocket, its weight both terrifying and strangely reassuring. The idea had lived in her mind for weeks, whispered in the quiet hours when she could not sleep. Now, with the knife cold against her hand, the idea had become something more. It was no longer a thought, it was an action waiting to unfold. She drove with the headlights low, her car trailing far enough behind to remain unseen. She knew exactly where he was going. Her observations, her notebook filled with entries, had prepared her for this night. Daniel's car led her to Melissa's apartment, a modest brick building tucked on the corner of a quiet street. She parked half a block away, rain streaking across the windshield, and watched as he walked Melissa to the door. They stood close under the glow of the porch light, sharing the kind of intimacy that once belonged to her. Claire gripped the steering wheel so tightly her hands ached. When Daniel finally walked back to his car and drove away, Claire's breath grew steady. This was her moment. She stepped into the rain, her coat shielding the knife, and followed Melissa into the building. The door hadn't closed fully, and she slipped inside, her footsteps silent on the worn carpet. The hallway smelled faintly of damp fabric and old paint, each step echoing faintly in her ears. She could hear Melissa moving inside her apartment, a faint hum of a television mixed with the rustle of movement. Claire stood for a moment outside the door, her body trembling, caught between hesitation and resolve, but hesitation had no place here anymore. She pushed the door open. The details of what happened next would never be fully known. Neighbors later reported hearing a sharp thud, then muffled noises that quickly turned into chaos. Some swore they heard a cry. Others claimed it was only the sound of furniture breaking. Inside that apartment, the fury Claire had carried for weeks erupted. The knife in her hand flashed under the dim light, her body moving with a strength born of obsession. Melissa never had the chance to fully comprehend what was happening, never had the moment to plead or explain. What took place was sudden, violent, and irreversible. When silence finally settled over the apartment, Claire stood over the scene with her breath ragged and her coat heavy with rain. The storm outside beat against the windows, masking the horror within. Her hands shook as she dropped the knife, the metallic clang loud in the room now emptied of life. For a moment she simply stared, the weight of her actions pressing down like stone. She had imagined this night endlessly, but the reality was far more brutal than the thoughts she had rehearsed in her mind. She fled the apartment before anyone could see her, disappearing into the rain-soaked night. Her shoes left faint marks on the wet pavement, quickly washed away by the storm. By the time neighbors called the police about the strange noises, she was already gone. The officers who arrived found the door ajar, the room dim, and the unmistakable scene of violence waiting inside. The discovery would shake the community, but the culprit remained a mystery in those first chaotic hours. Daniel was called in the following day after detectives learned of his connection to Melissa. Shock spread across his face as they questioned him, his affair suddenly laid bare for all to see. He tried to explain, tried to cover the tracks of his betrayal, but suspicion followed him nonetheless. Yet it didn't take long for investigators to turn their attention elsewhere. Whispers of Claire's behavior surfaced, her withdrawn demeanor, her recent obsession, her late-night drives. The story of a betrayed wife with motive and opportunity began to take shape. As the rain cleared and the streets dried, the image of Claire shifted in the eyes of those who once admired her. No longer the smiling neighbor with a tray of cookies. She was now a woman on the run. A woman who had let heartbreak transform into fury. The night of violence had changed everything, carving an unerasable mark not only on Melissa's life, but on the lives of everyone connected to the Whitmores. And though the crime scene had been cleaned, the memory of that night would linger, dark and unforgettable. Claire's escape after that night was clumsy, desperate and doomed from the start. She drove aimlessly through the storm, rain blurring her vision, her hands still trembling on the steering wheel. The knife had been left behind in Melissa's apartment, but the blood that clung to her coat and sleeves felt like a brand she could not wash away. She stopped at a gas station on the edge of town, stuffing the coat into a dumpster, then sat in her car staring blankly at the rain-streaked windshield. Every sound seemed amplified, the buzz of the fluorescent lights above, the hiss of cars passing by, the pounding of her own heartbeat. She knew she had crossed a line that could never be undone. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together the crime scene. Melissa's neighbors had described the strange noises, and a few recalled seeing a woman in a dark coat slipping out into the rain. Fingerprints on the doorknob and traces of blood in the hallway began to narrow the scope of their search. Daniel was questioned first, his affair dragged into the open in the harsh light of police interrogation. He admitted to it, ashamed, broken, his face etched with guilt. At first some believed he might have been involved, but the timeline of his movements that night cleared him. Soon suspicion turned elsewhere, to the wife he had betrayed. Detectives visited Claire's home, only to find it empty. Her belongings were scattered, as if she had left in haste. The garden outside stood overgrown and abandoned, a stark contrast to the woman neighbors had once known. Word spread quickly through the community, and whispers filled the streets. Some felt sympathy, others recoiled in horror, but all agreed on one thing: the Claire they thought they knew had vanished. 2 days later, she was found in a roadside motel 20 miles away. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and damp carpet, the curtains drawn tight against the light. Claire was sitting on the edge of the bed, her clothes wrinkled, her hair unwashed, staring at nothing when officers entered. She did not resist when they placed her in handcuffs. She did not speak a word. It was as if the fire that had once consumed her had burned itself out, leaving behind only ash and silence. Her arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The story spread quickly, fueled by the scandal of infidelity, betrayal, and murder. People replayed the events in hushed tones, piecing together their own versions of what had happened. The once idyllic Whitmores had become the subject of morbid fascination, their names splashed across headlines, their lives dissected on evening news segments. Daniel, left alone, bore the weight of public scorn as well. His affair had not only destroyed his marriage but had set into motion a chain of events that ended in blood. He sat in the courtroom during every hearing, his face pale, his hands clenched together, haunted by the knowledge that his choices had cost a woman her life. The trial was swift, but unforgettable. The prosecution painted Claire as a woman driven beyond reason, consumed by jealousy and rage. They showed the jury the notebook she had kept, filled with observations of Daniel and Melissa's movements. They revealed the digital searches she had made in the days before the murder, evidence of premeditation that weighed heavily against her. Photos of Melissa's apartment were displayed in the courtroom, the brutality of the crime made plain for all to see. The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but the evidence was clear. The defense tried to argue that Claire had been pushed to the edge by emotional torment, that her actions were the result of unbearable betrayal and psychological collapse. They painted her as a victim first, a woman whose life had been systematically unraveled until she broke, but sympathy was difficult to sustain in the face of such violence. The image of Melissa's final moments lingered too heavily, and the jury could not look past the cold, brutal facts. When the verdict was read, the room fell silent. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Life in prison, without parole. Claire did not cry, did not protest. She simply stood there, her face expressionless, as though the outcome had been written long before the trial began. She was led away in shackles, her footsteps echoing in the hallway as Daniel lowered his head in the gallery, shoulders shaking with silent grief. The case left a scar on the town that did not fade quickly. Neighbors drove past the Whitmore house with unease, its garden wild and untended, the once perfect home now a symbol of ruin. People spoke of Melissa with sorrow, her life cut short by another woman's rage. They spoke of Daniel with contempt, his betrayal seen as the spark that had ignited the tragedy. And they spoke of Claire with disbelief, unable to reconcile the friendly neighbor they had once known with the woman convicted of cold-blooded murder. In the end, the story was remembered, not only for the crime itself, but for the chilling lesson it carried. Love, when twisted by lies and obsession, could transform into something deadly. Trust, once broken, could unleash consequences that no one imagined. And behind the carefully crafted image of a perfect marriage, darkness had grown quietly until it consumed them all.